Tonight, FBI investigators at Quantico could be on the verge, perhaps, of a critical breakthrough in the Nancy Guthrie case, potentially using a new and cutting-edge technology that has proven to extract DNA from even the most difficult and degraded evidence.
For 11 weeks, it sat in the wrong place. Not hidden, not destroyed, not discarded. Just waiting. In a lab that didn't have the tools to hear what it was saying. Evidence found inside a home where something happened that nobody has fully explained yet. Evidence the FBI had asked for and waited for, while the clock kept moving and an 84-year-old woman remained missing. And here's what doesn't sit right. The technology to read it existed. The lab capable of extracting identity from almost nothing. From a single strand of hair with no root, no tissue, nothing most investigators would consider usable. That lab existed. It had already broken cases that sat frozen for decades. Cases with less to work with than this one. So why did it take 11 weeks? That question is not rhetorical. Because in a case like this one, where every hour carries a weight that cannot be calculated, where a woman with a pacemaker and daily medication has been missing since February, 11 weeks is not a footnote. It is the story. And now that the evidence has finally moved, the real question is what it's going to say. If you've been following this case, stay with us. Because what's unfolding right now may be the closest thing to a real breakthrough this investigation has produced. And if you're new here, welcome to Real World Crime Files. What you're about to hear is not speculation. It is a case being re-examined through a lens that didn't exist before, and what it reveals changes the way everything before it looks. It was a Saturday night, January 31st, 2026, in the kind of evening that feels ordinary in the way only a last ordinary night can. Unremarkable until it isn't. Nancy Guthrie had dinner with family. She was dropped off at her home in the Catalina foothills outside Tucson at approximately 9:48 in the evening. The garage door opened, and 2 minutes later, it closed. She was home. That was the last confirmed, undisputed moment. 2 minutes. A garage door, and then silence. Now hold that image for a moment because here is where the first thing that doesn't fit begins to surface. At 1:47 in the morning, almost 4 hours later, the doorbell camera at Nancy's home disconnected. Not failed, not malfunctioned due to weather or power. It disconnected. And at some point in those same early morning hours, the app monitoring her pacemaker, the device regulating her heartbeat, the device transmitting her vital signs remotely, went quiet. Not a goodbye, not a door, not a sound that anyone heard. Just two systems going dark, one after the other, in the same early morning window. By the time her family arrived around 11 the next morning, after she didn't show up for a church service she had never missed, the house had already told most of what it knew. Her phone was still inside. Her medicine was still inside. Her shoes were still inside. And her family later said publicly what investigators never quite said out loud. She was taken in her pajamas. An 84-year-old woman with limited mobility who could not, according to the sheriff of Pima County himself, walk 50 yards on her own. Someone moved her, in the dark, in silence. Through a house where blood was found near the front door. Blood that later tested as hers. Through back doors that were, when the family arrived, propped open. Not broken, not forced. Propped. Sit with that detail for a moment because it matters more than it seems. Prop doors suggest intent. Not panic, not a rushed exit. Preparation. Someone who knew they needed that exit available. Someone who had thought through the sequence of what was going to happen in that house before it happened. And that raises something investigators have been quietly circling since the beginning. This didn't feel random. The sheriff himself used a word in a national interview that tends to go unexamined. He said the suspect appeared comfortable at the scene, that he moved without urgency, that his behavior, it captured on footage nobody expected to exist, reflected familiarity, not the erratic motion of someone improvising in the dark, but the deliberate movement of someone who knew where they were going. Which means the question that should be asked, the question that changes everything if you ask it seriously, is not just who did this. It's how did they know? How did they know the layout? How did they know the camera? How did they know when the house would be quiet and when the timing would be right? Because that kind of awareness doesn't come from luck. It comes from something much more patient. And we'll come back to that because there is a behavioral detail in the footage, something that doesn't line up, that speaks directly to this question. When the FBI, working alongside Google, recovered footage from the doorbell camera that everyone initially believed was gone, data pulled from residual back-end systems, data that wasn't supposed to exist anymore, what they found was a figure moving toward that camera with purpose. He didn't scan the street first. He didn't hesitate at the gate. He approached directly, calmly, as though the approach itself required no calculation. And then he attempted to cover the lens. Not with a professional device, not with a jammer or a spray or any tool suggesting training, with foliage from a potted plant on her porch, her own plant. Now here's where the contradiction lives, and it is a contradiction that has no clean explanation yet. This is someone calm enough to approach a target's home in the middle of the night without scanning for exposure, deliberate enough to go straight to the camera, familiar enough with the property to know where the plant was. And yet, the weapon he was carrying, visible in the footage, was holstered so incorrectly over his clothing in a position that former FBI agents publicly described as not just amateur but unsafe, that investigators and behavioral analysts who reviewed the footage reached a specific conclusion. This was not a trained operative. This was not a professional. This was not someone with a background in surveillance operations or tactical entry. And that collision of information, the comfort, the familiarity, the deliberateness on one side, and the amateur weapon handling on the other, that is not a small thing. Because professionals and amateurs move through a scene differently. Professionals have distance, i.e., they use training to suppress emotion. But the comfort this individual displayed wasn't the detached efficiency of training. It was something else. Something more personal. Stranger guesses. A planner knows. But there is a third category, someone who is familiar. And familiar is the most unsettling of the three. In the days after Nancy disappeared, there were moments that felt briefly like threads. A man detained during a traffic stop in Rio Rico, not far from the area. Investigators looked at him. He was released, not connected. Then gloves. Black gloves, found approximately 2 miles from Nancy's home. They appeared to match the gloves worn by the suspect in the footage. Testing returned DNA from an unknown male. For a moment, just a moment, it felt like a direction. Then that direction closed, and the DNA was traced to a local restaurant worker, someone with no connection to this case. Cleared. And those two near breakthroughs, dissolving one after the other, are worth examining not just as disappointments, but as information. Because the gloves were found 2 miles away, if they belonged to the suspect, then someone was moving through a residential area after what happened in that house, disposing of evidence calmly enough to travel 2 miles before discarding it. That is not panic, that is management. Around this same period, ransom notes began arriving at local news stations. A demand for $6 million in Bitcoin. Deadlines, February 5th, then February 9th. Both passed. No confirmed communication between the family and anyone holding Nancy. No verified proof of life. But here is the detail inside those notes that cannot be overlooked, regardless of whether they were ever confirmed as authentic. Whoever wrote the first letter, according to reporting at the time, included specific details about Nancy's home and what she was wearing on the night she was taken. What she was wearing. That is not something you find online. That is not something you guess from a news report. That is something you know because you were there, or because someone who was there told you. And that single detail, sitting inside an unverified document, is the kind of thing investigators do not dismiss regardless of what they say publicly about it. One former FBI agent who reviewed the notes pointed to a specific word choice, the use of USD for dollars, and suggested it might indicate someone not native to American usage, or conversely, someone deliberately constructing the appearance of that. Neither interpretation is comfortable. Both raise a question the investigation has never formally answered. Stay with us, because what we're about to get into changes the shape of everything that came before it. This is real-world crime files, and this case just shifted. 11 weeks after Nancy Guthrie disappeared, the FBI received something. Not the announcement of a breakthrough, not an arrest, not a press conference. A transfer of physical evidence, specifically, a hair samples collected from inside Nancy's home during what investigators believe were the initial phases of the crime scene examination. Hair that had been sitting in a private laboratory in Florida. Hair the FBI had requested weeks earlier. And the reason this matters? The reason the 11-week gap between the request and the transfer is not procedural noise, but active tension in this investigation, requires understanding what that hair might hold. Forensic science has a standard relationship with hair evidence. If a hair has a root, a follicle, tissue at the base, it can yield DNA through conventional extraction. Standard testing, straightforward. But most hair found at crime scenes doesn't come with roots. It comes as a shaft, just the strand. And for decades, that meant it was, for all practical DNA purposes, essentially useless, until it wasn't. There is a method now, whole genome sequencing, that can extract nuclear DNA from the shaft of a hair alone. No root required, no follicle. Just the strand itself, read at a molecular level deep enough to produce what is called a SNP profile, a genetic fingerprint detailed enough to run through genealogy databases, detailed enough to build a family tree from, detailed enough to identify a person, not because their DNA is already in a criminal database, but because a relative's DNA is in a publicly accessible ancestry database. This is not theoretical. This is the method that broke the Gilgo Beach serial killer case, a case that had been cold for more than a decade. Hairs recovered from victims, rootless, and conventional testing useless, were processed by a specialized laboratory in Santa Cruz, California, through this exact method. The profile that emerged led investigators through genetic genealogy to a suspect's wife, to his daughter. The case that seemed impenetrable cracked open because of what a single strand of hair, previously considered worthless, was finally able to say. The FBI does not test this evidence at Quantico. They work with that same laboratory in Santa Cruz, Astria Forensics, which has developed and refined this capability to a level no other facility has matched. The hair from Nancy Guthrie's home is heading there. And now consider what that means for this case. Not just forensically, structurally. Because the DNA recovered from this crime scene was described by investigators as mixed. From more than one person. Complex, difficult to untangle. The Florida lab struggled with it. But hair is single source. One strand, one person's genome. The complexity that made the mixed DNA so difficult to work with does not apply to a single hair. One strand, if it belongs to someone who had no reason to be inside that house, carries inside it the identity of a person who cannot be erased from the scene by any amount of planning. And here is the detail that should sit heavily with anyone following this investigation. The person who entered that home, Whoever approached the camera, covered the lens with a plant, moved through that space in the early hours of February 1st, they were not wearing a hazmat suit. They were not a ghost. They moved through a physical environment. Hair falls. From a head, from an arm, from a face. It falls without the person knowing, without them deciding, without them being able to prevent it. If they left a hair in that house, they left a part of their identity. And if they believed it would never speak, if they believed technology had limits that would protect them, that belief may have just expired. But here is what has to be said carefully, because responsible storytelling requires it. We do not yet know whose hair this is. It may belong to Nancy. It may belong to someone with a perfectly innocent reason for having been in her home at some point before that night. The analysis hasn't been completed. The extraction hasn't been confirmed. The process, even on priority status, takes time. Months, potentially. And even if a profile is produced, even if it doesn't match anyone with a known reason to be there, even if it enters the genealogy database and begins producing family connections, that path requires investigation, verification, and legal process before it becomes anything definitive. What we know is this: the investigation has moved somewhere it hadn't been before. The evidence is in the hands of the institution best positioned to hear what it has to say, and whoever is responsible for what happened in that house may not have fully understood. At the time they were there. At the time they were calm and deliberate and moving with the comfort of someone who knew the space. That the environment itself was making a record of them, not just on camera, not just in the footage recovered from back-end data they didn't know existed, but at a molecular level, talk in something as ordinary and invisible as a strand of hair. There is something else that doesn't sit right about this case, and it lives not in the evidence itself, but in the space between agencies. The FBI stated publicly at the time of the hair transfer that they had requested this material more than 2 months earlier. The Pima County Sheriff's Office had been using the Florida lab, a reputable facility used by many agencies certified by the FBI itself, to handle DNA analysis from the beginning of the investigation. When pressed about the transfer, the sheriff's response was measured. He said the two agencies had been working together since the start. That this was not new information, but it was new evidence going to a new place with new capability. And the distinction between those two statements, not new collaboration versus new forensic pathway, is not a small one. A former FBI agent who has been covering this case alongside Brian Enton offered a pointed assessment. She said that in a case of this nature, where biological evidence is present, where the digital forensic footprint is limited, where no confirmed motive has been established, and no suspect has been publicly identified, the evidence should have gone to the FBI from the beginning. Her estimate was that the investigation may have lost 11 weeks. 11 weeks. In a case where a missing person has a pacemaker and requires daily medication. In a case where the sheriff himself told NBC that the suspect could absolutely strike again and that there is a danger to the public. But 11 weeks during which the most potentially identifying evidence in the investigation sat somewhere it couldn't be fully read. That is the weight of this case. Not just what happened on the night of February 1st, but what happened in the weeks after it. What decisions were made? What was sent where? What was delayed and why? Because investigations don't just move forward or backward based on what evidence exists. They move based on what choices are made about that evidence. And every choice in a missing persons case is a choice made against a clock. The Pima County Sheriff's deputies, more than 300 of them, held a vote. 241 voted no confidence. 0 voted confidence. The union called for resignation. The lead investigator assigned to the case was reported to have no prior homicide experience. These are not irrelevant details. They are not political noise. They are the institutional context inside which the most important evidence in this investigation was being managed. And when you hold them against the 11-week gap, when you hold them against the FBI's expressed frustration with their limited access to the DNA, when you hold them against the behavioral analysis of a suspect who moved through that home with the comfort of someone familiar, a pattern begins to form. Not a conspiracy, not an accusation, a pattern of friction, a case where the environment, the agencies, and the evidence have been working at partial capacity and partial alignment under partial control. And somewhere inside that friction, Nancy Guthrie is still missing. Her family offered $1 million for information leading to her recovery. They stood on camera and said something that required a courage most people will never be tested to find. That they made the offer with the understanding that she may already be gone, but that they remain hopeful. Savannah Guthrie, who has maintained composure through public appearances that would break most people, posted at what she called an hour of desperation, asking anyone with information to come forward. She is 84 years old. She cannot walk 50 yards alone. She was taken in her pajamas without her medication on a cold night in February, over 75 days ago. And the investigation continues. Quietly, beneath public statements and agency friction and dissolving leads and ransom notes with unverified origins. Beneath the press conferences and the no confidence votes and the footage recovered from systems that weren't supposed to hold it. In a lab in California, something may be forming right now. A sequence, a profile, a thread that leads somewhere real. The sheriff's office released a statement that should be held onto, not as reassurance, but as instruction. They said that they believe it is the Tucson community and the greater southern Arizona area that holds the key to resolution. That someone knows something. That a person out there may have information they don't even realize is significant. Think about what that means. Not in official language, in human terms. Someone, somewhere saw something. Maybe not on the night of February 1st. Maybe in the days before it. A car that appeared more than once on a quiet street. A face that passed through a neighborhood with no obvious reason to be there. A conversation that didn't sit right, remembered only after news broke that an 84-year-old woman had vanished. Because the behavioral profile emerging from this case suggests preparation. The comfort at the scene, the knowledge of the camera, the propped doors, the specific details inside a ransom note. None of that emerges from a single night of impulse. It emerges from a period of observation, of learning, of watching a routine until you understand when the window opens, and watching leaves traces, not always obvious ones, not always ones that raise alarms in real time, but traces. A repetition noticed in the background. A presence that didn't belong but didn't stand out. The kind of thing that lives in the peripheral memory of someone who was nearby and hasn't yet connected what they saw to what they know happened. If you are watching this and something is surfacing, something small, something you almost dismissed, the tip line is open. The family's reward is real. And in cases like this, the most important piece of information often doesn't come from a laboratory. It comes from a person holding something they didn't realize mattered until they saw a story like this one and felt something click. This is real-world crime files. If this case matters to you, share this with someone who might know something. Like this video so more people find it. Subscribe because this investigation is not over, and neither are we. Like the case, as of now, stands in suspension. Not solved, not closed, not abandoned. Moving beneath the surface towards something that may eventually force clarity. The footage exists, the hair exists, the behavioral record of someone who moved through that house with intention exists. And even the most controlled plan, even the kind of plan that propped a door, covered a camera, moved in the dark without hesitation, has a limit. It must interact with reality. And reality remembers. Modern environments hold more than people realize. Back-end systems, residual data, molecular traces left without awareness or consent. The suspect who stood on that porch on the night of February 1st and covered a camera with a plant believed they were managing the record of their presence. But the record they didn't know about, the fragment, the strand, the invisible signature that may have already been waiting. In cases like this, there is always a moment when fragments stop being fragments and become a picture. When the scattered pieces, the camera footage, the hair, the behavioral profile, the institutional fracture, the 11 missing weeks stop existing separately and begin to speak in one voice. That moment hasn't arrived yet. But something about the way this case is moving suggests it may be closer than it appears. And when it does arrive, when the picture finally forms, it will not announce itself dramatically. It will emerge quietly, precisely, from a lab where identity hides inside the shaft of a hair that someone left behind in a house they should never have entered. And whoever is responsible may already know, even if they haven't said it, that something they left behind is being listened to. The only question still unanswered is whether they'll be found before that answer comes too late. Nancy Guthrie, still missing, still someone's mother, still waiting to be found. If you have any information, contact the Pima County Sheriff's Department or the FBI's tip line. The family's $1 million reward remains active. This is Real World Crime Files. We'll be back when this case moves. And